one of the things that really gets under my goat is when people talk about God in a way where it's obvious they don't know him at all, and they get angry because God did this and God did that. I don't know about you, but that really I feel like protective of God, I don't know. I can hear some agreement. I don't know whether that's your place, but it certainly is my place, and it's like a natural inclination. Well, several months ago, I was reading this book, and in this book, this author went on to the rantings and ravings of his disappointment with God. And I tell you what, the accusations were flying thick and fast. He was hitting it in both barrels. And I tell you what, I was just, getting angrier and angrier. It went on for pages. And this guy, obviously, didn't just want to say this stuff. He wanted to put it in print so that other people could listen to what he was saying about God and his incredible disappointment with God. And for someone like me who's been raised on reverence of God and respecting God and placing God in the highest place, in the first place, for someone like me, I tell you what, it was difficult not to close the book and throw it in the bin. But I persisted, and I persisted for a reason, because I felt, well, there must be guys like this in our community. There must be people out there who are sorely disappointed with God, and maybe this book is going to give me some insight into how to reach people who were disappointed with God. So I persisted with it as much as I didn't want to. But as I did, I wasn't prepared for the polluted way that I felt inside as I was reading these words. I'm thinking, it feels like it's not good for me to be reading this stuff, It feels like it's not good for me, but I think that I've got to. I think that I've got to get over this this heart that this man had, that God was some vengeful dictator that was out to get him. He had God in this box that was just everything. God was just at him, pulling him down. And I felt like I needed to defend God. Have you ever felt like that? You need to be God's defender. I needed to defend God. And I don't know, when you get worked up, whether you start talking to yourself. When I get worked up and there's no one around, I start talking to myself. You've got to be kidding, I'm saying to this book, you've got to be kidding me. You don't know God at all. He's not like that at all. Do you have those times? Well, we don't have time for me to read the whole thing, and I'm not sure that I even want to recommend the book to you, but I just thought I'll read you a little excerpt from it. And this is a pretty gentle excerpt from the rest that he'd written. Let me just read you this part. This is what the guy wrote. I shouted for help, God, and got nothing. No answer. I stood to face you in protest and gave you a blank stare. You turned into my tormentor. You slapped me around and knocked me about. You raised me up so I was riding high and then dropped me and I crashed. I know you're determined to kill me, to put me 6 feet under. Yeah, disappointment with God, that's right. This bitterness is just oozing out of this guy. Oozing out of him. And he obviously felt like he expected more from God. He should have had a better deal. And maybe no one was there to tell him that God's not like that at all. I wish that I had been around. I wish that I had been someone who knew this guy so that I could, mate, he's not like that at all. Let me tell you my experiences of God. Maybe I can give you some insight. Maybe he didn't have a personal relationship with God through his son, Jesus Christ. I don't know. Probably doubtful that he did. Maybe like so many who only believe that God's going to bless them, he was one of those ones that when disappointment came, he didn't know what to do with that. So, God's a blessing, God, why is this happening to me? Maybe he's one of those guys that don't have God in their life at all. Did you hear about the atheist? And he was saying to his friend, I'm an atheist. And the guy just didn't believe him. He said, you're not an atheist. How could you be an atheist? And he says, I swear by God, I'm an atheist. Maybe this guy was, I don't know, maybe he was just someone that really paid God no attention at all throughout his life, and then suddenly something happens. Oh yeah, then there's God. Then I can blame someone. Maybe he was like that. What conclusion would you come to about this guy? Maybe you'd feel sorry for him. Maybe like me, the anger would rise up. Maybe you'd saying to yourself, I'm glad he wasn't around when he said that. I'd give him some fivefold ministry, that's for sure. Maybe, maybe, I don't know. I don't know. We don't have the backstory to this guy, so it's difficult to know what emotions we would be coming up with. Would we feel defensive of God? Would we feel that we needed to protect God? What would we feel like when we're reading words like that? What would you feel like? I've got a little confession to make. The truth is, I do know a little bit of the backstory of this guy, and so do many of you. Perhaps if I read those words again in the format that you would normally see them with the citation, then it might become a little bit clearer. Why don't we put that up on the screen? I shouted for help, God, and get nothing, no answer. I stand to face you in protest, and you give me a blank stare. You've turned into my tormentor. You slapped me around and knocked me about. You raised me up so I was riding high and then dropped me and I crashed. I know you're determined to kill me, to put me 6 feet under. Job, of course, is a story of a righteous man who was dealt with unjustly, who loses everything he owns and 10 of his children in one day. And then he's faced with the sudden deterioration of his health on top of that a very short time after. He has 3 friends who are later joined by a 4th friend who come there with the intention of comforting Job. And for the first 7 days, they just sit with him in the ashes and say nothing. It was the best thing they could have done. The worst thing they could have done was open their mouths, which they eventually did after 7 days, and they began to find blame in Job for his demise. And see, when you normally read the book of Job in the Bible and you're aware that there's a backstory to this and you're aware of where it's going to end, then it's very simple to read the verses that we've got up there on the screen and sort of just breeze over them because you know where the story's going and you know where it's come from. But what if you don't know the story? What if you're listening to the rantings and ravings of this man and you're getting angry? You're getting defensive. You're getting protective. Could it be that some of us might be closer to the 4 friends than we might have imagined? Could that be? You see, I think the 4 friends were just acting out human nature. What's sad is it's still human nature, even though we have a very different understanding of how things work in our world. Put yourself in the events taking place. Maybe even put yourself in the position of one of the 4 friends in this story. Then maybe you find, like I did, that I'm not so sure I wouldn't have said similar things to Job as his friends said to him. This year we have a focus in SEF on wholeness, and this particular term we've been looking at personal wholeness, whole me, our personal brokenness. Next term we'll be going into whole us, what wholeness looks like in a church corporately. And then in the last term it'll be whole them. What do we do with a broken community as a church, and how do we bring wholeness to our community? It's an exciting series. And I think probably with this message, it straddles all 3. So maybe you're going to hear it again sometime this year in a slightly different context, I don't know. But I will try and focus in on the whole me this morning, and also a little bit of the whole us as well. It may manifest itself as disappointment when people have a problem with God in our community. It may manifest itself as disappointment with the church. But really, isn't the church the body of Christ? Isn't the church, as Leslie reminded us, the bride of Christ? And some people who say, well, I'm fine with Jesus, no problem with Jesus, I've just got a big problem with his church, or with the church, or with people in the church. And someone once said, well, if that's what you're saying, then it's like going up to a couple and saying, I like you, mate, but I can't stand your wife. It doesn't go down so well, does it? So maybe this disappointment or discouragement or anger that people have with the church is actually a disappointment with God. A disappointment with God. And how do we handle that? How do we handle it when we're feeling that disappointment? And how do we handle it when those around us are also feeling that disappointment? Disappointment with God is a big issue in our community. If we look at the percentage who live out there, of people who at one time, at one place, had some sort of connection with the church and now, for whatever reason, no longer go, I would suggest to you that disappointment rates pretty highly as the reasons why they're no longer going. It may dress itself up as disappointment with the church, and we need to know how to handle it, how to address it. However, there are issues in us personally which work against true reconciliation with God. You see, if a relationship is authentic, and I'm talking about any relationship now, I'm not just talking about your relationship with God, but a husband-wife relationship, a parent-child relationship, a friend-to-friend relationship. If it's to be an authentic relationship, it's got to have room for the airing of disappointment with one another. It's got to have room where discussions can take place about unmet expectations. It's got to have that room, otherwise it's not really an authentic relationship if it doesn't have room for that. And whether those disappointments are real or imagined, but discussion works that out. See, if there's no room in a relationship for the expression of disappointment, then don't take it the wrong way, because disappointment will vent itself somehow, some way, because we feel it. We feel it with one another, we feel it in our relationships with one another, and sometimes we feel it with God. Ruth Bell Graham, wife of Billy Graham, once said in relation to marriage, if two of you agree on everything, then one of you is unnecessary. So we do need time for disagreement in relationships. And of course there are disagreements and disappointments in any relationship, and they need to be spoken about and they need to be worked through, not swept under the carpet. Perhaps the reason we don't go there is because we've not done a good job of airing disappointments in the past. And maybe we've used disappointment to manipulate the person that we're speaking to. Maybe we've used it to put them on a guilt trip. Maybe we've done it in anger and frustration, we've aired those disappointments. There are all sorts of wrong ways to do it, and because we've done it so wrong for so long, we sweep it under the carpet. I'd rather not go there because it's not going to be good. But I'm here to tell you that there are healthy ways to air disappointment, certainly with one another, but also with God, and helping other people to be able to do that. You see, when we air disappointments in accusatory tones and words, what we're effectively doing is closing down real communication about disappointments. Any real relationship must have room for disappointments to be discussed respectfully, with the goal of a stronger relationship being the outcome. And shouldn't we also then, where our feelings towards God are concerned, have a safe place to speak about them? Job, I think you would agree, had every right to be disappointed with God. He didn't know that a conversation had happened between God and Satan in heaven. He didn't know that he was a subject of some celestial test. He didn't know all of that stuff that happened in the backstory. And I don't know whether, even if he did, whether it would have changed his feelings towards God, because he'd lived a righteous life. And yet all this injustice was coming upon him. I doubt it would have made much difference at all to how he felt, actually. He had been treated unjustly to an extreme that I would hope that none of us ever have to endure. But he had an authentic relationship with God. And that relationship had room for expressions of disappointment, even those expressions that went on for dozens of chapters. What his friends didn't understand, that God is his own defender. He doesn't need man to defend him. What he needs is man to seek him for the needs of others. That's what God is there for in this sort of predicament. Perhaps if Job's friends had spent more time seeking God about the needs of their friend Job instead of defending God against Job, the outcome could have been quite different a whole lot earlier. When you're disappointed with God, I hope that you have friends around you that give you room to air those disappointments and actually help carry you through them. Because there's something that draws us back to God even when we feel we've been wronged by him or treated unjustly in some way. Somehow we get drawn back to him. Somehow we know that he can still, in spite of my circumstances, he can still be trusted. And Job could still say, in the midst of his suffering and disappointment, even though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. You know, twice now I've been with men who have been dying what we would call prematurely. And on both occasions, the book of Job has ministered to them. It came as quite a shock to me that people would find comfort when they know that they're about to leave this world, that they would find comfort in that book. There's just something about it. Some of you will remember John Stewart, who passed away back in 2008 of pancreatic cancer, and many of you have met Craig Gibbon. He's just preaching here only a few weeks ago, the missionary that our church has supported for many years. Both of these men have found help and hope in the book of Job. And I'm not saying that they were disappointed with God. I'm not saying that at all. But there was something about the writer and what he wrote. There was something about this conversation that he was having and the way he was unloading and unpacking. There's something in that was ministry to both of these men. Job could cry out to no other than the one he believed was the source of his suffering. And I believe that we as a church and certainly as individuals can leave room for people to air their disappointments with God without trying to defend God or to shut people down. Then we may just be inviting them into a dialogue with God himself and the comfort and the reassurance that can only come from him. We need to remember that faith to believe for God's goodness cannot emerge that if we're denying the facts of our struggle. Faith to believe for God's goodness cannot emerge if we are denying the facts of our struggle. Facing the facts and moving forward in faith go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. Abraham faced the fact that he was old and that Sarah also was beyond childbearing, yet he persisted in faith. It says in Romans 4:9-10. And Abraham's faith did not weaken, even though at about 100 years of age, he figured his body was as good as dead. Notice, he didn't say, I don't care that I'm 100, I'm still feeling vigorous. He didn't deny where he was at in life. He didn't deny where his body was at in life. He faced the facts of those things. And so was Sarah's womb, good as dead. Abraham never wavered in believing God's promise. In fact, his faith grew stronger, and in this, he brought glory to God. I would suggest to you that faith grows when we face the facts. Christianity is not about denying what's going on. It's not about living in some sort of alternate reality. Christianity is facing reality, but also knowing who God is in that reality. I interviewed Craig and Jackie. Many of you were here that Sunday when we interviewed them and they visited our campus. But Craig spoke about what the doctors had told him. The doctors were out of answers. They'd tried all the treatments. There was nothing left to give him. And at no point did he even hint that they'd got it wrong or that he denied the seriousness of his condition. At no point did he do that. He knew that without a miracle, his life would end within months. Turned out to be weeks. Yet he committed himself to God and his will. And Jackie added this: if the worst that can happen to us as followers of Jesus Christ in this life is that we die and we go to be with him, we've really got nothing to complain about. Faith arose not despite the facts, but in the facing of them. Does our dialogue with God reflect that we are facing the facts of the disappointments of our lives? Or do we think that our conversations with him always have to be joyful and smiling and upbeat? That we need to put on some sort of facade when inside we're dying on, oh, well, God, you know. That's not the sort of God he is, and it's not the sort of relationship that he wants with us. He wants authentic relationship with us. And he wants us to share what's going on in our heart. And he wants us to share the disappointments in our lives. If we go silent on God when the experiences of our lives are causing us pain and struggle and grief, then we may just be missing out on the very thing that will draw us back to the God that can be trusted. if we don't allow others to express their disappointments with God in the safety of our relationships as brothers and sisters in the family of God, then we may be unwittingly moving them away from God rather than closer to Him. It's not something to be avoided. It's something to be talked about. Sadly, Job didn't have a friendship group that grieved with him, but a group trying to find the wrong that he had done to cause such misery. And in the end, there were 4 of them telling Job to fess up, Job. What have you done? He had an accusing bunch of guys around him rather than a trusted group of mates who were carrying him and his misery to God. You know, John 9 gives us some insight into the belief people had around those who were suffering in Bible times. They believed that suffering was retribution for sin. If you were disabled or disfigured in some way, well, either you or your parents were the cause of that. That's what they believed. Sin caused that, therefore, in a way, you're getting what you deserve, or at least what your parents deserved. Sorry about that. Even Jesus' followers, the ones that had been with him, even they believed this. In John 9, Jesus and the disciples come across a blind man. And the disciples ask Jesus a question. And in the question, they're giving away their frame of context, their frame of mind about disability. They ask, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins? Now, there's a big question. Born blind because of his own sins? Within that question is it possible to sin in the womb? Is it possible that, that God will call us to account because we're conceived in sin? Born blind, I mean, nothing had happened yet. What does that mean for us, Jesus? If that's the case, it was a pretty courageous question to ask. Was it because of his sins or his parents' sins? What do you say, Jesus? And don't we go there sometimes in our own minds? We see someone going through a real struggle, whatever it might be, maybe a real struggle with their finances, and we start to think, well, they've been a bit frivolous with their finances, haven't they? They haven't used them the right way, have they? Maybe they're going through a struggle in their relationship. Well, if he treated her a bit better, he wouldn't be going through this. Don't we go there in our own minds? We can go there so quickly. We see struggle, we look to blame. Well, Jesus answered the question, and he said this, it's not because of his sins or his parents' sins. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. You see, what the disciples didn't understand, what Job's friends didn't understand, was that disappointments happen and they may have no connection at all to what we may or may not have done right or wrong. We can't immediately assume that a person's circumstances are connected to their sin because they could be worlds apart. Really, if that were the case, if our circumstances were connected to our sin, a lot of us would be a lot worse off than what we currently are. Some disappointments are connected to our sin, of course. That does happen. Some people suffer because of their own actions. But even in those times, it's not good enough for us who may be suffering as a result of our own sin to just shut up and suck it up because after all, I'm getting what I deserve. That's not good enough. It's not good enough to say, well, I brought it on myself, therefore. God wants dialogue. It's not good enough to observe those who are suffering because of the result of their sin, and we know that for sure. It's not good enough to just observe them and think, too bad, too sad. They should have known better. You see, because our God is a God of forgiveness and healing. He does both. He does both. A God whose power will be at work in those who are disappointed. Job's 4 friends didn't get it. In contrast, in Mark chapter 2, we read of 4 mates and their friend who was undergoing an ordeal, probably of his own making. And these 4 mates picked up their paralyzed friend, Matt and all, and took him to Jesus. And when they got to where Jesus was and found that the place was too crowded and they couldn't get their friend there, they went to the trouble of going to the top of the house and digging through the roof so that they could get their friend, their paralyzed friend, in front of Jesus. And the Bible says that Jesus saw the faith of the friends. No mention is made of this guy on the mat at all, actually, when you read it. No mention, apart from he's paralyzed, and the first thing that needed to happen was his sins needed to be forgiven. So Jesus forgives the man's sins. There's grumbling in the crowd. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus says, well, so that you know that I've got authority on earth to forgive sins, let me now deal with the result. Get up and walk. The man picks up his mat, walks out in full view of them all. What great mates. What great mates. Are you that type of friend? Seeing a person go through difficult circumstances, and we feel really sorry for them when we know that they're not to blame, but how sorry do we feel for them when we know that they are to blame? How ready are we to take them, disappointments and all, to Jesus? Carry your disappointments to God, and you'll be given a new perspective about God. You may not have your why questions answered, but you will witness aspects of God that you have never seen before. This was the experience of the paralyzed man. He came with his misery, and he found a forgiving and a healing God. And Job too saw things about God that he could not have known otherwise, and saw them through his tears as he disclosed his disappointments. Some years ago in my devotions, I had this habit in the margins. I was reading through the Old Testament. I had a habit of writing the word gospel in the margins of my Bible every time I found an illustration of what Jesus did in the New Testament. I used to like finding them. Still do, actually. Love coming across them. So I did the same thing in the book of Job. Now, Job, Bible commentators believe that Job is one of the oldest, if not the oldest book written in the Old Testament. It doesn't appear in that order, but that's what they believe. They believe that Job lived somewhere between Noah and Moses. He was in the age of the patriarchs. And they believe if Job didn't write the book himself, Moses certainly did. So this is one of the oldest books in the Bible, and yet 9 times in the margin, I wrote gospel. As Job is ranting and raving and bringing up his disappointments and airing them, you find that he's getting these revelations of God and who God is. Things about Jesus he could never have known otherwise unless God had revealed it to him. 9 separate times, gospel at least. And that's just through my observations. Maybe you could find more. Through his tears and expressions of disappointment, Job got a revelation of Jesus. And these are the words he used as he wrote, or as Moses wrote, what went on at that time. He spoke of a redeemer. He spoke of a mediator, a friend, a guide, an advocate, a perfecter of faith. Here's a man who's airing everything that's gone wrong in his life, and he's lost a lot. And yet he's seeing God as a mediator. He's seeing God as a perfecter of faith. He's seeing God as a redeemer, as a friend, as an advocate. He understood things about God he could not have known otherwise, and would not be revealed until Jesus came. And it all came through the expressions of disappointment that he felt and that he shared. One Bible commentator wrote, "Those who turn fully to God in their great sorrow, even if they argue, plead, and protest in God's presence as Job did, will find a pathway nearer to the tender mercies of heaven than they have ever walked before." Of course, for Job, that revelation of God would continue as God finally did respond and speak into his situation. And you know, sometimes we read those final chapters there of Job, and we read them as some sort of rebuke that God is giving Job. Can I suggest this to you, that God is giving even fuller revelation to Job of who he is? Job never had his why questions answered. Read it. He never had a why question answered. But he came into greater revelation and appreciation of his God, even in the midst of his disappointment. Have I lost this ear thing? Yeah, I did. When friends of ours are willing to allow us to air our disappointments, particularly those that we may have with God, what they are doing is loving us into greater revelations of the character of God and carrying us to Jesus. Will we in love allow our friends to face the facts in their faith like Abraham did, and thereby realize the rewards that go with exercising faith despite the facts? Often what we want to do when our friends are expressing disappointment with God is fill them up with knowledge. What we say is, well, God's not like that. Let me show you a chapter and verse in the Bible that proves that God's not like that. That's not in his character. He doesn't send calamity upon us. He isn't the author of disease. That's what sin's done in the world. We say things like that, and they're all true, actually. They're all true. But for the person who's going through disappointment, it's like blowing air into a balloon. Knowledge puffs up, the Bible says. Love, on the other hand, builds up. Imagine all those words of knowledge going into a balloon. And suddenly that person experiences a disappointment. It's like a pin going in. All that knowledge. Have you ever noticed that when you're disappointed yourself, all the knowledge seems to go out the window. All that you knew seems to go out the window. But what touches you is what touches your heart at that time, not your head. The 4 friends could have told their paralyzed friend, there's no way, mate. It's too crowded. We've walked all this way to get you here. Sorry, missed out. Yeah. Love took them to the top of the roof. Yeah. Now what do we do? Well, let's dig through it. Love dug through the roof. And love lowered their man in front of Jesus. And love forgave him and love healed him. Love, 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 love. Not knowledge. Knowledge is good. But in this case, love is what makes the difference. When you read those words on the screen, they're still there, yeah. Redeemer, mediator, friend, guide, advocate, perfecter of our faith. Isn't it interesting that all of those words are describing words of someone who's acting on your behalf? They all have that connection to you. Someone who's acting on your behalf. And we know them now to be descriptors of Jesus, of course. But for Job, who said them, they described a God who was coming close in the midst of his disappointment. If Jesus would not hesitate to fully come into our world, leaving heaven and all its glory to live like us so that we could become like him, there's no way he's not going to come close to us in our disappointments as well. Can I ask the musicians to come back? We're going to allow an opportunity for prayer shortly, but I thought it would be helpful at this point to pray a prayer corporately. And it may help to deal with some of the feelings that maybe you're feeling with regard to God at this present time. And it's a prayer to forgive God. Now, let me be quite clear. God does nothing wrong. God does nothing wrong. Yet, our feelings towards him cannot always accurately reflect what we know in our head to be true. So he doesn't actually need to be forgiven. However, sometimes we harbour angry thoughts against him because he didn't do what we expected him to do, and we have to let those feelings go.